The night he typed the message, his hands were shaking so badly that he had to rest his wrists on the kitchen counter, the hum of the refrigerator sounding louder than his own breath, and he wondered what kind of man becomes desperate enough to ask a stranger for help with his child when the world has already taken so much from him. What would you do if your savings were gone, your job was hanging by a thread, and your little girl's fever had refused to break for 3 straight nights, her small body curled into itself as if it were trying to disappear? Would pride still matter, or would love push you into choices you never imagined making? Matthew Reed was 34, a widower living in a modest rental outside Columbus, Ohio, with a leaking roof and walls that carried more silence than warmth. His daughter, Sophie, was 6, all thin wrists and pale cheeks since the illness came, her laughter replaced by a fragile quiet that followed him from room to room. The doctors said the infection would pass, but rest was critical, and rest was impossible when Matthew had to work night shifts at a warehouse just to keep the lights on. He had already missed too many hours, already received too many warnings, and the thought of losing his job terrified him more than the darkness outside their windows. The ad he posted was simple, almost ashamed of itself, asking for overnight help, nothing improper, just someone to watch over a sick child while a father tried to earn one more paycheck. When he received a reply within minutes, he stared at the name on his phone for a long time, reading it again and again, as if repetition could make it safer. Her name was Hannah Collins, a 23-year-old nursing student passing through town, offering help without questions, her message ending with a single line that said children deserved care even when life became cruel. When Hannah arrived, carrying nothing but a small backpack and eyes that seemed too calm for someone so young, Matthew felt a strange mix of relief and guilt settle into his chest. She didn't look like someone who would change anything, she looked ordinary, almost forgettable, and maybe that was what made her presence feel safe. The house smelled of medicine and stale coffee, and Sophie slept fitfully on the couch, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit that had lost one ear. Hannah moved quietly, her steps careful, her attention immediately drawn to the child as if nothing else in the room existed. Matthew left for work that night with his heart lodged in his throat, checking his phone at every red light, expecting disaster, bracing himself for regret. But the messages that came were gentle updates, brief notes saying Sophie's breathing had steadied, that her fever had eased, that she was sleeping more peacefully. For the first time in weeks, Matthew allowed himself to focus on the road ahead of him instead of the weight pressing down on his chest. That single night became 2, then 3, not because Matthew planned it that way, but because life kept unraveling faster than he could tie it back together. Hannah stayed, not for the money, which was barely enough to cover her meals, but because she saw something in the quiet desperation of that home that reminded her of her own childhood, of a mother who worked too many hours and a father who never came back. She cooked simple meals, cleaned without being asked, and sat beside Sophie for hours, reading softly until the little girl's eyes grew heavy again. Sophie began to smile in small, hesitant ways, her fingers curling around Hannah's hand as if holding onto something solid in a world that had suddenly felt unsteady. Matthew watched this transformation from a distance, unsure how to feel gratitude without also feeling fear. What if this kindness was temporary? What if she left and the silence came crashing back even louder than before? Hannah noticed the way Matthew flinched at every cough, the way he slept sitting upright in a chair because lying down felt too vulnerable. She noticed the framed photo on the hallway wall of a woman with kind eyes and a crooked smile, the dust gathered along its edges. Without asking, she wiped it clean one afternoon, placing it back carefully, as if honoring a presence that still lived there. Matthew felt something loosen inside him then, a knot he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Weeks passed, and Sophie's strength returned slowly, like spring after a brutal winter. The fever broke, her appetite came back, and her laughter filled the house again, bouncing off the walls that once echoed with grief. Hannah prepared to leave, her studies calling her elsewhere, her backpack packed the same way it had been when she arrived. The thought of her absence brought an ache Matthew hadn't prepared for, a realization that this stranger had become part of the fragile balance holding his life together. On her last evening, the three of them sat on the front steps as the sun dipped below the trees, the air warm and still. Matthew watched Sophie lean against Hannah, content and peaceful, and felt the weight of all the nights he'd spent believing he was failing as a father. He realized then that asking for help hadn't been weakness, but an act of love, a choice that had given his daughter more than medicine ever could. Hannah left the next morning before dawn, a quiet note on the kitchen table wishing them health and courage, reminding Matthew that kindness could appear in unexpected forms and leave lasting footprints behind. Life didn't become perfect after that. Bills still arrived, work was still exhausting, and grief still visited Matthew on quiet nights. But something had shifted. He volunteered at Sophie's school, met other parents, allowed himself to lean on people instead of pushing them away. Sophie grew stronger, not just in body, but in spirit, carrying with her the memory of a stranger who had shown her gentleness when she needed it most. Years later, Matthew would think back to that desperate night and realize it had been a turning point, not because someone saved them, but because he allowed himself to be saved by compassion. If you've made it this far, pause for a moment and ask yourself what choice you would make if love demanded you set your pride aside, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story truly touched your heart, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing, because sometimes a simple act of support can help stories of hope and second chances reach someone who needs them most.